Hello, and welcome back to my channel. Because today, January 27th, is International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which was chosen because it is the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. As I mentioned in the previous video, I'm going to be discussing this invaluable reference book, which I bought my own copy of in 2017. It's been very invaluable in researching my historical fiction and just looking up other things for historical purposes as well. Now, I believe I first heard about this and when I was reading Reena's Promise, a story of sisters in Auschwitz, which was written by Reena Kornreich-Gellison with Heather Dunn Macadam. Sadly, Reena has since passed away, but it's a very wonderful book about how she protected her little sister, Danka. Well, Danka wasn't that much younger than her. I think Danka was about 2 or so years younger, but like her whole life she loved like protecting and looking after Danka, and she promised her parents she would look after her, and it's just a wonderful stories of how these two sisters survived from the spring of 1942 all the way up to the spring of 1945 when they were liberated. Unfortunately, that's one of my many books which is in storage 900 miles away because my brother is just not being nice to me and shipping my books down. But anyway, and I was for a while I was looking at it in the UAlbany library, particularly when I would go there on Shabbos Saturday afternoon in the the many long hours between like Shabbos lunch and when we would have like the third meal of the day in the evening and then have the concluding services in Havdalah, which has a candle and spices and stuff to end the Sabbath. And because I cannot carry in the public domain more than 4 cubits on the Sabbath unless there's an Eruv offense, I obviously couldn't like have a little notebook with the call numbers written down of the books I like to read in the UAlbany library during those long daylight hours, so I would have to like memorize them, and I would go up to the appropriate floor in that appropriate section and pull the books down and spend like a couple of hours reading them in a carol. And I would also sometimes go there on Sundays as well to read these like reference books, and obviously on Sundays I could take notes from and take pictures from my computer, and this was one of the very invaluable books which I've used for, as I mentioned, my historical fiction. I do have a blog post about how I do research for my Shoah historical fiction. I might possibly get into that a little bit later in this video and also in a future post as well. So this book, it documents almost every single day the camp was in existence, and as it gets farther on into the history, it's like almost every day because in the beginning, but there wasn't that much going on. It's not every day, might only be like every week or like a few days within a month, something like that. And I bought it for only $2 or $3 on Amazon. I believe it was Amazon, not eBay, from a third-party seller. This is an old library book, and this is just like a gigantic steal, as you can see the former library card. And there I also bought a few other former library books over the years, and you shouldn't be shy about buying a book just because it's former library instead of like almost as good as new used, because sometimes that's the only copy you can find and it's just as good as any other book. To date, I've not found any markings in this book, which is good. I really don't like markings in a book. That's just a personal preference I have. And I know that seems kind of like goody that I would only write in a book unless it's to like fill in somebody's death year, to write my name and the date I got it in the very front. And I also often took this book to write-ins when I still lived back home in Albany, New York. We would go to Denny's every Sunday night. Now, it's a really, really heavy book, and sometimes I'd also take other really heavy books with me. I also, thank God, they are with me. They're not in storage. I have the Holocaust Chronicle, the World War II Chronicle, and 3 day-by-day books about the Third Reich, the Pacific War, and World War II in Europe, which are very, very invaluable when you're doing historical fiction set during the 1940s, although unfortunately I don't have a book documenting the China, India, Burma theater, which is really an unsung, unrecognized part of World War II. And so it basically records pretty much almost everything you can think of, and it's always dispassionate. It's well, obviously she's not saying it was good or anything like that. She's just recording what happened in a dispassionate voice, for historical research. This isn't a personal memoir. It's just recording historical facts. So it's among the things it discusses the building of the camp and how they decided which new buildings were going to be done and where, how many people arrived from where, people were transported to a place or came from another camp instead of like a ghetto or a prison or a transit camp, what tattoo numbers were assigned. And the early prisoners had their numbers tattooed on their chest instead of on the left forearm. And I did listen to an interview with Emmanuel Mittelmann. He might have passed away by now, I'm not sure, but he was one of the last surviving prisoners who still had a number tattooed on his chest. I believe he came there in 1942, and I used some of the thing he said in one of my own historical books about how he made his buddies eat like crushed up charcoal to cure their diarrhea, and that ended up saving their lives. And obviously we know activated charcoal does have legitimate scientific and medicinal properties if you're sick, so that's like, something really interesting and helpful to keep in mind if you're ever sick like that, God forbid. And it like obviously talks about transports, escapes. There were a lot of escapes. People don't realize some of them were successful, some of them weren't, and it provides the names of all these people who escaped, and sometimes the names of like famous artists or sports people or such like that who were in the camp, although unfortunately, like most people's personal names are not recorded unless, they were already in the camp books for whatever reason they were considered noteworthy. It discusses the promotion of camp brass and the communications between them. There are a couple of maps and photographs in here. It talks about like this didn't really happen too much. I think 1942, 1941 was the last year they allowed it, but there were like a number of releases in the beginning, particularly for political prisoners, and also mentioned when German not prisoners of war, I guess, political prisoners were killed or died in the camp, and they would cremate the bodies. They would send an urn of ashes back to the family, and I think after a certain point they stopped doing that. And once in a while there were even like marriages in the camp between like political prisoners or just really extraordinary reasons. Obviously this wouldn't have happened between the majority of prisoners. And it talks about prisoner death, like how many were in the camp at a certain point, or like what people were dying of, or like how many like people had died within a certain week, and the general causes. And talks about like medical experiments. Obviously I mentioned that sometimes it would mention names of people. Like talks about the camp resistance, which was very active and deserves to have more discussion about it, because many people don't know. They think we were all going like sheep to the slaughter and never fought back. That's complete nonsense. And there were births in the camp too, particularly in the Czech family camp and the so-called gypsy camp. I know that word isn't like appropriate anymore, but that is the word they used in that day. They called them gypsy instead of like Roma or Romani or travelers. That's just how history unfolded. And there were like obviously like births sometimes in the so-called hospital, or people women undergoing medical experiments. And sometimes like near the very end of the camp's life, women were able to give birth, and they obviously would be sent to the gas immediately because gassing operations had stopped or the camp had been abandoned like that. But sometimes there were like births, and they were all recorded, but they were very meticulous about this paperwork. And it mentions, like, for example, gas malfunctions. This was also mentioned in Reena's Promise. There were sometimes entire groups arriving who were all admitted to the camp, even elderly people and children, because if the gas wasn't working, they all had to be admitted to the main camp. And sometimes, thank God, these people were allowed to stay registered in the camp, even though under like normal circumstances they would have been murdered immediately because they were too young or too old to be considered helpful. It just discusses the evacuation from the camp in great detail in the last chapter for 1945, and the liberation of the camp and how the conditions the Soviets found it in. But obviously there are no records of the majority of people admitted to the camp. They're obviously not going to have the numbers of those people, or like particularly the Hungarians who were admitted to what was called Lager C, a transit camp. During the spring and summer of 1944, the camp was swelled with people arriving from Hungary and places annexed to Hungary, which are in modern day Romania and I think a little bit in Czechoslovakia. The Czech Republic and Slovakia, and a little bit in the Ukraine too. There were so many people arriving. There was no time to like admit them all to the main camp, or even like I know this sounds horrible, but like there were properly gas them. Like many of particularly the children, were like burned alive in giant pits. They just couldn't like all gas them because they weren't counting on all these people arriving, and so it was like totally out of control. And if you've ever listened to an interview from a Hungarian survivor, someone who lived in an area which was occupied by Hungary at that time, many times they will not have a number on their arm, because if they were in Lager C the entire time and never admitted to like a work detail proper in the main camp, there would have been no purpose for them to be tattooed. And like sometimes they obviously would have been like transported out of the camp, particularly as it was starting to close down, and taken to like a different camp, and they would not have been tattooed then either, because Auschwitz was the only camp which tattooed their prisoners. A lot of people have this misconception, unfortunately. And obviously, as I mentioned, if you were like gassed on arrival, God forbid, your name would not have been recorded. And obviously, we do not have the exact numbers of people arriving from Hungary, because there were just like way too many to keep track of. But fortunately, if you're doing like historical fiction set during this time, or if you're researching family, we do have the exact numbers of arrivals, like who was admitted and who was murdered from Drancy, which was a transit camp near Paris, Terezin, which was in the former Czechoslovakia. It was like a big ghetto, like the so-called model camp, but it actually wasn't as good as like people said it was, although even in like comparison to other places, it was like fairly decent to be there. And we do have the numbers from Westerbork, which was a transit camp in the Netherlands. And we also, in the back, there are biographical sketches of the perpetrators. Each year starts with an essay generalizing what happened within that year in the camp. As I mentioned, many photos, and it's very important for historical fiction research, especially with like real tattoo numbers. Like, for example, you do not want to give your like characters tattoo numbers that really belong to someone else, or that wouldn't have been used for people in that country, or people arriving in that general time, or were never given at all. I just don't mention numbers at all. I just talk about the tattooing process and how they like, feel about the tattoo, like while they're getting it, or like afterwards, for example. And also the dates of arrival. Artistic license exists, within reason, so long as you like acknowledge and explain it in something in the front and back matter. But you can't just like wildly converge from what actually happened, particularly because that gives fuel to the fodder of Holocaust deniers. And obviously, like the number of people admitted to the camp, you can't have like a giant, like huge family or group all getting admitted if, at that particular date and from that country, only like, let's say, like 30 people out of 1,000 were actually admitted to the camp. And also transports, it's good to keep in mind that too. I guess I'll just talk a little bit about from my webpage when I've written about how I do the research. I posted this in September 2016, and I like showed some of the books which I use for researching and some of the good websites, and talked about metadata when you're doing research at the USC Shoah Foundation, which is a really, really invaluable research, which I highly recommend, and I possibly may speak about it more in a video on doing historical fiction research. And so you want to try to find like survivors who follow the same general trajectory as your characters from the same country when you're doing this research from the interviews, and there's less room for unintentional inaccuracies that way. And don't just take one person's word for it. Memory is fallible, and some survivors unintentionally get their dates slightly off or put events in the wrong order. And that's another reason why this is such an invaluable book, because you can look it up and check against what that person actually said. It doesn't mean, they were deliberately like lying or idiots or whatever. It just means like because of the way like trauma changes your brain, or just like generally in the experience of living through a traumatic experience, they might have genuinely believed, like, for example, they were taken out of the camp sometime during like November 1944, and it was actually in like late October, like, for example, or they believed they were transported there like May 9th, and they actually really arrived on May 16th. Though people do get things wrong just because of the general experience of trauma, and like memory is, infallible, and we'll probably never understand everything about the brain. And then obviously there's the Mengele Trope, which I've discussed in a blog post in the past, and it gets a little into this book because it doesn't really like expose the trope for what it is, but it generally gets across like he was not this like superhuman like evil person. Like obviously he was like complete evil, and I hope he's burning in hell, but he was not, multiple different places in the camp all at the same time doing all these different things, like all these survivors, it's like you would think he was the only person who ever did anything there, and he was like the number one head honcho in the camp because he's like doing medical experiments, like doing selections on the women and children, doing selections on the men at the same time, doing additional selections in front of the like gas chambers and pulling out a few people at the last minute for various reasons. This didn't happen very often, but once in a while it did happen. And he's throwing children into like bonfires, and he's shooting at people at night, and he's like carrying out selections in Lager C every single day. Like seriously, he was pure evil, but he was not, you know, a superhuman. To just, you know, be realistic about that too as well. And obviously there were subcamps. This book doesn't get into really at all. I think it mentions sometimes, but there were a lot of subcamps of Auschwitz, so that's like a subject for another book if you're interested in that. And obviously you want to like narrow it down if you're doing historical research. Don't just have a general thing you're writing about. And obviously the timeline is something to keep in mind too, which is yet another reason this book is just so valuable. And I probably will be doing a future video more in detail about how to do research for historical fiction if you're writing about the Shoah. And I was going to like just to give you guys a little sample of the kinds of things which are in this book. Let's see. Oh yeah, this was like, for example, one of the diagrams they have. It's showing the star system. It's obviously not in color, but it like indicates what colors were used for what. They were not just all, you know, like yellow magenta beads. Star of David, like for example, political prisoners wore red for, you know, obvious reasons. Gay men wore pink triangles. So-called gypsies, the Roma, they wore brown. Jehovah's Witnesses and the like offshoot groups like Bible students, they would wear purple. So-called asocials wore black. I think those were not criminals. Criminals were green. Like asocial people were like, it was basically a catch-all term for a lot of people. And I, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe lesbians may have been also considered like so-called asocials. They didn't wear pink triangles. There's a lot of like misinformation about that. The only same-sex attracted people the German Nazis were really interested in were gay men. Lesbians were like generally left alone, or if they ended up in the camp, it generally was not because they were like same-sex attracted. And immigrants would wear blue triangles, and if you were in two different groups at the same time, you would wear overlapping triangles of different colors. Like for example, if you were both like a convicted or suspected criminal and like a so-called gypsy, you would wear like green and like blue or whatever. I'm sorry, like green for the criminals and like brown for gypsies, or like action prisoner, red security detainee, like so-called like asocial Jews, like French political detainees. Sometimes there would be letters on the badges. And also like to read one of the really heroic episodes of the camp, which happened on October 7th, 1944. It was during the autumn holiday of Sukkot. I know some Christians still use the kind of old-fashioned term the Feast of Tabernacles, but Jews don't really use that term anymore. We just generally call it Sukkot. So this was the Sonderkommando who were responsible for like burning the bodies and like untangling them after they were murdered in the gas chambers. They staged this giant revolt. They knew most of them would probably be murdered afterward, and they were. Every third Sonderkommando was killed. The brave women in the underground who were helping with smuggling them gunpowder for over a year, they were tortured and interrogated for months, but they never gave up any names except names of people who were already dead. And these brave 4 women were publicly hanged in the camp on January 5th, 1944. But this was like a huge act of resistance. We should all be like proud of it. So on Saturday morning, the camp resistance movement informs the leader of the Auschwitz combat group, who was in the special squad, that news has been obtained about the camp's management plans to liquidate as quickly as possible the surviving members of the special squad. This news probably confirms the information that the operation announced a few days ago by the SS to reduce the size of the special squads of crematoriums 4 and 5 by 300. Named prisoners allegedly slated for transport is to be carried out. The named prisoners decide to mount a resistance. At the midday break, during a conference in Crematorium 4, the staff of the Special Squad Combat Group is surprised by a German BV prisoner who threatens to report them to the SS. The informer is killed on the spot. At 1:25 p.m., the threatened group attacks the approaching SS guard unit with hammers, axes, and stones. They set Crematorium 4 on fire and throw several self-made grenades. Afterwards, some of the prisoners from Squad 59B reached a small wooded area nearby. At the same time, the prisoners of Squad 57B, who work in Crematorium 2, become active. When they see the flames and hear the shooting, they believe that this is a sign for the general uprising of the prisoners in the camp. They overpower the head capo, a Reich German, and push him and an SS man, whom they have disarmed, into the burning crematorium oven. They beat to death a second SS man, tear up the fence that surrounds the crematorium area, and flee. The prisoners of Squads 58B and 60B in crematoriums 3 and 4 undertake nothing because some of them are not informed about the plans, and also because the SS men there bring the situation quickly under control. The immediate intervention by the SS guards, the surrounding of the crematorium compound, and the heavy machine gun and artillery fire in the direction of the small woods near Crematorium 4, where the prisoners mount a resistance, quickly squelches the uprising, and Reichsgau pursuing SS men block the way of the fleeing prisoners of Squad 57B. The prisoners barricade themselves in a barn and prepare to resist. The SS men set the barn on fire and murder the prisoners. 250 prisoners die in this battle, among them the organizers of the uprising, Zelman Gradowski from Suwałki, Józef Warszawski from Warsaw, actually Józef Dorebus, who was sent from Janci, Józef Teresinski from Łódź near Grodno, Isaac Kalniak from Łomża, Leib Langfuss from Warsaw, who was sent from Makow Mazowiecki, and Leib Panusz Hershko from Łomża. A firefighting squad is sent from Auschwitz I to put out the fire in Crematorium 4. These prisoners who put out the fire, under supervision by the SS, are witnesses to the suppression of the uprising by the SS and the shooting to death of the members of Squad 59B. The firefighting squad is then brought to Reichsgau to put out the fire in the barn. An air raid alarm prevents the SS men from a further pursuit. In the evening, all the prisoners who were killed are brought to the grounds of Crematorium 4, and the remaining members of the special squad are driven together. Another 200 prisoners from the squads that took part in the uprising are shot to death. A representative of the commandant delivers a threatening speech in which he announces that if there is a repetition of such incidents, all prisoners in the camp will be shot to death. Afterward, work is resumed in crematoriums 2, 3, and 4. During the uprising, 3 SS men are killed by the prisoners: SS Corporal Rudolf Erler, SS Corporal Willi Friese, and SS Corporal Josef Prudka. SS Brigadier General Oskar Dirlewanger suggests to SS Commander-in-Chief Himmler a project to enlist German prisoners, former criminals in the concentration camps for the SS Special Unit Dirlewanger. The project is approved by Himmler and relayed on October 15th to SS Lieutenant Berger, the head of the SS main office. It was just a really heroic episode, and sadly, I think a year or so ago, the last known surviving Sonderkommando, Dario Gabai, who was born in Greece, passed away. He was, I think, in his mid to late 90s. He was just like a heroic witness to this uprising. He survived a lot, and he gave 2 interviews to the USC Visual History Foundation. That's also a wonderful resource I would highly urge you to check out if you're researching your family or the Holocaust in general, if you're doing historical fiction set during this time. And also, I can't recommend this book enough. It's, kind of depressing to read, and it's a little bit exhausting to get through all these, dates and facts and figures and numbers, particularly because there aren't, names behind most of these people except when they're already noted for historical reasons. For example, Father Maximilian Kolbe, a Polish Catholic priest who, took the place of a prisoner who, had a wife and children, and he was killed by a phenol injection to the heart after 2 weeks of being starved to death in a medical experimentation block. And other people, for example, writers and artists and sportsmen and people who both successfully and didn't successfully escape the camp. But anyway, it's one of the top-notch books I would recommend to you if you're at all interested in this subject, or it's something you need to do because of genealogical or historical research or whatever. So thank you very much for watching to the end. Please consider liking, subscribing, sharing and commenting, and I'm really looking forward to building my channel a lot more on this coming year, and maybe my next post will be either on Sunday or Monday. I'm thinking of trying again to do Franz Liszt Symphony of Dante's Divine Comedy, which is a blend of like music and music history and literature. So see you guys very soon. Thanks. Bye.